In the last video, we covered how the Rambam and Reb Sadia Gaon helped Yidden tremendously by writing Sfarim that answered questions of philosophy according to Torah. And that explained that when we speak about Hashem in the Torah and describe him with physical characteristics or physical things, that we're really not saying that Hashem actually has those things, but that we're talking metaphorically. We're talking like in the form of a mashal, of a parable. And how that really helped Yidden very, very much, and how many Yidden returned to Yiddishkeit and to Judaism, and they came back and they were Baal Tshuvas, and many Yidden were saved from leaving Yiddishkeit in the first place. We ended off last video by saying how about 750 years ago the Zohar was discovered, and how all of this changed. And in this video we're going to discuss exactly what happened, the challenge that it presented, and what the Chacham did about it. About 750 years ago, there was some people going through, I believe it was a cave of some sort, and they discovered this old sefer. And upon reading it and looking at it more and bringing it to a few Rabbanim, they realized that it was the Zohar. Now the Zohar, for those who don't know, was written, a big part of it was written by Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. The Zohar is kind of like the Chumash of Kabbala. There's many Sfarim in Kabbala. There's many Kabbalists that wrote Sfarim. There's Arizal, who he didn't actually write a Sfarim, but the Reb Chaim Vitalis, his chief student, wrote Sfarim of the Arizal's teachings. There's the Ramak. There's many Kabbalah Sfarim. But the Zohar is the father of all Sfarim. It's like the Tarsha B'Ksav of Kabbala. And in there's many different midrashim and different things from Moshe Rabbeinu, from different periods of Kabbala up until Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Reb Shimon Bar Yochai sealed the Zohar. Now, in the Zohar, the issue with the Zohar was that the Zohar essentially is Kabbala. That's what it is. And so the Zohar presented a number of challenges. The challenges that it presented was that when a pasuk would say that Hashem has 10 feet, the Zohar would say 100% Hashem has 10 feet. And if it said that Hashem had 20 fingers, it would say, yes, Hashem has 20 fingers. And so this created a very big problem. Because till now, most Yidden did not know anything about Kabbala, because it was kept secret, like we said. Moshe Rabbeinu taught the Yidden the rest of the Torah, but the secrets of the Torah, i.e. Kabbala, he did not teach. And suddenly now with Kabbala here in the open, there was this major issue. And there was another issue that Kabbala raised, and that was that when it came to davening, there was all these kavanas people were supposed to have when davening. They were supposed to have, when you say Hashem's name, you should have this in mind, and a different thing in mind, and when you say this word. And it created a lot of confusion, like what really is going on. And so there was different reactions from different Rabbanim. At first, there was a big question of whether this really is the Zohar. That was a very big question. Some people said it was the Zohar, some people said it wasn't the Zohar. Eventually, it was authenticated that it was really the Zohar. And so the question became how to respond to this. Now that the masses knew about Kabbala, and many Rabbanim started seeing that people had access to this information, and these questions were coming up, how do they deal with it? So there were some Rabbanim that completely rejected, essentially, Kabbala. They didn't reject that it wasn't part of Torah, but what they rejected was that it's not something that we need to learn and something that we need to qualify or prove or even reckon with, so to speak. It's a part of Torah made for tzaddikim, or special people in every generation, but not for regular people at all. And concerning the kavanas, there was a common saying by some of the Rabbanim was called Eini mispal el kedas atinik, which loosely translates, I only daven like a child, which means instead of having all these fancy kavanas and all these different combinations and thinking about it, instead of that, I daven like a child. Just like a child just has simple faith about Hashem, so do I. Now, originally this kind of worked, but there were many Rabbanim that embraced what Kabbala said, and therefore it became a real issue. Yidden were again having a big problem reconciling what philosophy was saying with what Kabbala was saying. Now let's try to understand for a second what Kabbala really is saying. Kabbala is not saying that Hashem actually has hands and feet. It's very important to understand that. Kabbala is coming to introduce something very novel. What is that? According to philosophy, according to seichel, according to intellect, according to understanding, there can only be two kinds of things. There's creations, that's us, and then there's our creator. There's Hashem, the creator. Everything is either God, Hashem, or things that Hashem created. There is nothing else besides for the Creator and the creations. There is nothing else. Which kind of makes sense, right? There's Hashem, and then there's whatever He created. There is nothing else besides that. There is no other entity. Kabbala introduced a thing called godliness, which is a very, very, very difficult concept, and people spend their whole lives learning about it. And in Chassidus, we have many Maimarim trying to help us understand this issue. But what godliness is kind of Hashem with a last name. What do we mean by that? We mean that besides for Hashem, there's an energy that emanates from Hashem called godliness. And this energy creates the worlds and creates different things. Now, let's immediately put something here as a disclaimer. Godliness has no control without Hashem. Hashem is just like a malach. Hashem controls, a malach cannot do anything that Hashem doesn't want him to do. So too, godliness is not something that has any control by itself. It's 100% something from Hashem, but it's not a creation. A malach is a creation. Godliness is not a creation, but it's not God. And this is the tricky part. You see, Chakira would talk about malachim and say that malachim is a type of a creation, and they have a certain physical characteristics, or they would say that it's a mashal. If you can't prove that a malach exists, it would be just a mashal. And that was the end of it. But Kabbala brought this whole idea of these whole different kind of worlds. There's Atzilos and Bria, there's different spiritual worlds, and this kind of thing between Hashem and creations. And this is what Psukim mean when Hashem has 10 hands or 20 fingers. These are talking about different levels of godliness. Now, this is not so apparent when you're reading a sefer like the Zohar without lots of explanations. And even with this explanation, it created a lot of confusion. And so Yidden, again, were having a major issue with this Kabbala and the things that Kabbala was teaching. And even though many Rabbanim rejected it, but because there were many Rabbanim that embraced it because it was a part of Torah, so Yidden were having a big problem with this. And they were saying, how do we understand our Yiddishkeit? How do we understand Hashem, essentially? This is really going back to the issue of being able to ask questions about Hashem and answering it. And so in the next video, we're going to cover how Chassidus came to answer some of these questions that Kabbala brought, and explain how Chassidus explains it.